right, great. Thank you and welcome everybody. Just a quick note, we are recording. And as with any good privacy professional, we always start with our privacy notice about the recording. And with this one, for those who are watching the recording, you're probably watching this sometime after this recording was made. Please be aware that legislation is not cast in stone. So our discussion today, some of it may not be as relevant when you're viewing this recording. So at the end of the formal presentation, there is a list of links, and you can always visit that to get the latest versions, etc., and updates and responses to changes to legislation. All right, with that, let's begin. So very briefly, I'm Jarrell. I'm your facilitator today. I'm the university's Deputy Information Officer under both POPIA and PIA. Before joining the university, I worked in technology risk advisory with a focus on controls, business resilience, and privacy. And before that, I worked as a ASSAf consultant, which is a enterprise resource planning software platform focusing on human capital management. I'm also a certified data privacy solutions engineer. And most importantly, I'm not a lawyer. And that's brings me to a very interesting point about privacy. We don't view it as a special discipline unto itself. Rather, privacy relies on a host of other disciplines working well together in an integrated and coordinated manner to give effect to the right to privacy. So we're a relatively small team here at the university. My other colleague her background is in industrial psychology, and we do have an admitted attorney on our team as well. But as you can tell from that team build-up, we bring a host of different skills and ways of thinking about personal information and privacy. And that's what I want to encourage throughout today. So if you take nothing else, it's about challenging the way we think about privacy as it being more than simple compliance with a piece of legislation. Today, we have a not too long agenda. I'm going to share some good rules of thumb that you can use when navigating personal information. We're going to focus on what's the real risk. And we're going to discuss some privacy basics. We're going to discuss our shared responsibilities. Under that, I'll also be focusing on our context of privacy within the university, within South Africa, within the Academy of Science of South Africa's Code of Conduct, and internationally as well. Then I'll get into our privacy regulation within Stellenbosch. And then I'm going to get into the real meat of things. We'll be discussing impact assessments. Under point 7, what's the real risk continued? I'm going to invite you to lightly hack yourselves to see how you might have been compromised in the past and what you can do about that. I'm going to close off with sharing some resources, and then we should have plenty of time for questions. Oh, also, feel free to interrupt. I can't see the chat right now, but Fadwa, if something pops up, please feel free to interrupt me and we'll take it from there. Right, rules of thumb. Number 1 is don't panic, right? POPIA can seem intimidating, but it should not be considered as scary or unknowable. As I mentioned before, it's not its own, privacy isn't its own isolated discipline. It's a good reminder and a driver for ensuring good practices drawn from other disciplines. And that includes from good research data management, adherence to research ethics, norms, and standards. In doing so, you probably cover a lot of your privacy compliance already. So it's a lot easier than you may be worried about. All right, so rule 1, don't panic about it. Number 2, no surprises. So this is a nice way to test whether your planned approach, be it in recruiting potential participants to a research project, or if you're considering doing secondary data analysis, is to think about, would the individuals involved be surprised if you contacted them, if you asked them for their personal information, or if they find out what you've been doing with their personal information? A big chunk of privacy compliance is about being open and transparent about what we do. And if you take it from the approach of limiting surprise, then managing that element of privacy compliance becomes a lot easier. So whenever you're thinking about, for example, take yourself, when you're filling in a form somewhere and you're not sure what a particular field is there for, right? If you don't understand what the asker is going to do with that information, you might be tempted to just fudge a number, like the last digit in your cell number when signing in somewhere. Right? So by removing that element of surprise and building a layer of trust with your participant, you're more likely to get truthful answers. So big chunk of privacy, let's manage and limit surprises. Third rule of thumb, I'd like to encourage you to all to think like a cyber criminal. And I've got a simple exercise that we can do together, yeah? And I want you to think of email addresses. Just an email address. What could you do with an email address? And there is a clue on screen right now. So pop it in the chat, Fadwa, if somebody volunteers anything in the chat, please let me know. So what could we do with just an email address? I'll give you an easy one to start with. We could launch a spam campaign. We can just add email addresses to a mailing list and advertise whatever we want. At the very simplest level. You get a bit more sophisticated, maybe we're phishing. So phishing is when you attempt to trick or convince the recipient of the fish to take a certain course of action. Colleague, do you have a thank you for muting? All right. Okay. So we step it up a notch and we get to phishing. But after phishing, what do we have? Spear phishing, perhaps. Spear phishing is very targeted fishes when an attacker customizes the fish to sound more believable. Spearfish requires a bit more context than just an email address in most cases, but say imagine spearfish would be if somebody knows that an email address belongs to a certain individual banks with a particular bank, a spearfish attack would attempt to look like a message from that bank. And we can get even more advanced and we can get CEO fraud attacks. How many of you have heard about this attack, I wonder? The sad news is that it has been executed successfully at our institution itself. So a CEO fraud attack is essentially when an attacker pretends to be somebody of some seniority and under that pretense, sends an instruction to somebody within an organization and asking them to carry out some sort of instruction. The more damaging versions of this, for example, would be to hurry a payment to to hurry the payment process to get a fraudulent invoice paid. Another common version of this is asking an employee to go and purchase something like vouchers and send the codes. There's some sort of emergency why the CEO can't do it themselves, and they really need these vouchers to do some sort of important transaction. And once those codes are sent through, the money is gone from that employee who had otherwise expected to be able to expense or ask for reimbursement for that business expense. So those examples of attacks, you can use an email. With this, I wanted to highlight that even though you're thinking you just have a list of email addresses in front of you, that still has value. If you have a list of student email addresses in front of you, they have a sun.ac.za domain next to them, which informs an attacker where the owners of those email addresses are affiliated with our university, that they might be students, etc. And that allows an attacker just from that to create a phish or spear phish campaign. And then if we look at some of our departmental websites where we gladly and happily advertise our organizational structure, saying who manages who, with contact details and photos, etc., we enable attackers to commit CEO fraud rather easily. So what I wanted to do with this slide is get you to stop and pause and think. Something that may seem innocuous at first glance might actually be used to do significant harm. And what I would like to challenge you with this slide is to really look at things in your research project, within your academic department, or in your past environments website, and have a think. Do we actually need to expose all of this information? What purpose does it serve? And we compare that purpose to the risks we've discussed today and think about it. All right, do the risks actually outweigh the benefits or not of pushing that information? So in my space, as I mentioned before, I am also responsible for the promotion, our university's response to the Promotion of Access to Information Act. And through that legislation, we need to be contactable. We need to push certain measures or certain information about how to submit a request under the Act to the university. So we need to make those details publicly visible. But because we do this, and because we know we do this, we view every request with a healthy level of skepticism. We don't automatically trust every email that lands in the POPIA inbox. We look at them closely and say, is this a legitimate request, or is this perhaps something else? So if you are needing to push contact details on your website out, those whose details have been exposed need that extra bit of support, right? To help them identify and respond to potential attacks. Okay. So in summary, information has value, and in some cases, information can be used to do harm. And from our side, we measure value as follows. The more harm you can do with a piece of information, the more valuable that information is. And the more easily you can do harm with the piece of information, the more valuable the information. So that's why I'd like to challenge you when looking at your research data management plans, etc. Sometimes put on a cyber criminal hat and rethink and relook at what you're asking your research participants to share with you. Right, and this should be the last good rule of thumb, at least for now. Privacy is really about integrated thinking. Integrated thinking is explicitly called out in South African codes of corporate governance, such as the King 4 code. It is, in short, it's the idea or the acknowledgement that an organization affects multiple different types of capitals. And I give some examples. which include, for example, financial capital, human capital, manufactured, intellectual, natural. So, for example, Eskom needs to make a decision about burning diesel, right? And there's a financial question to that too, but there's also a question about the environmental impact of burning diesel. And there's also the question of not providing electricity. The integrated thinking is the act of, when you're faced with a decision, is to consider all the capitals in play and to make an informed decision about with full cognizance of how that decision affects the different capitals. And we can see that in play at the institutional level all the way down to the research level. And then a little briefly, okay, so what's the real risk if we don't comply with POPIA? So we've discussed, for example, somebody's information being compromised and used in an attack, right? So that has a real implication to the attacked individual. But organizations also face a risk. IBM Security conducts an annual study into the cost of a data breach. And for their 2022 report, they analyzed 550 organizations globally to determine a variety of factors surrounding information breaches. They discovered on average it took 277 days to identify a breach. So to put that into some real terms, if we were breached on New Year's Day, and we look at where we are today, we're still about 5 to 6 months from actually closing that breach. The average cost of the breach was over $4 million US, and for those South African companies that participated in the study, it was over $3 million US. And this cost is based on a variety of different activities. So there is a cost involved with detecting and responding to the breach initially. So it's about waking up your cybersecurity team if it is a cyber event. It's potentially reaching out to legal counsel. All of those elements have some sort of cost. If the staff is internal, then there's an opportunity cost. If it's an external team that is responding, then there is a procurement cost involved. Then our South African legislation requires when we have a breach at an organization, that organization needs to notify the Information Regulator of South Africa and notify all affected data subjects of the incident. And so there is a cost in doing that too, especially based on the channels required to reach out to data subjects. There might be a cost involved there. Then there's the cost of lost business. So from a university point, for example, if we were caught as a university with a major breach that affected a European partner, that would probably affect future negotiations with European partners. So there's a risk of lost business. And then, of course, there's a whole bunch of activities that happen after a breach as well. For example, in a cyber event, let's say ransomware, the cost of recovering systems to business as usual again also adds to the total cost of a breach. And then most of these breaches, so most of the organizations polled this year or last year, they suffered more than one breach as well. So what does that mean? Almost a fifth of all the breaches considered in 2022 by IBM were attributed to stolen or compromised credentials. And as we've been talking about different information attacks, here's another one for today, credential stuffing. So that is when an attacker collects stolen or compromised account credentials. So for example, username, email, and password combinations. They take those compromised account credentials and then attempt to log into other services using those same details. So I'm not going to ask anybody on the call today to out themselves at this point, but I can guess that there might be a few of us today who use the same password at multiple different online services with the same email address used to log in. So let's say you were caught in a compromise with LinkedIn, Canva. Your credentials were caught there, and then an attacker attempts to use that to access your Gmail account, your personal email account. If you think the attacker would successfully get in to your email account that way, then you may need to consider changing a few of your passwords. Because once that has been compromised, then everything else is. Because most services these days have a I forgot my password option that works through your inbox. All right, so maybe another thing that I hope you learn today is let's be a bit better with our passwords. All right. Now I know my very first rule of thumb was don't panic. I hope I haven't started any panic. We're going to get into the less scary stuff now. All right, we're going to do some privacy basics. First up, context of privacy in South African higher education. Right at the top, internationally, there is international legislation in play. If a country doesn't have specific privacy legislation, there's a really good chance that it still discusses privacy in their equivalent of the Bill of Rights. Then at the national level, we have legislation that discusses privacy. Examples include the Promotion of Access to Information Act and, of course, POPIA. Then as a sector, Universities South Africa have developed guidelines for all public universities to consider in their implementations or their response to POPIA. ASSAf have also provided guidelines for recommendations on complying with international legislation as well. And perhaps of more importance to those on the call today, the Academy of Science of South Africa is looking to develop a code of conduct for all research involving human participants in South Africa. A code of conduct let me start here. POPIA allows a sector with enough representation to position a code of conduct that clarifies the act within that sector. When a sector drafts such a document, they need to present it to the regulator, and the regulator will make a decision whether to accept the code of conduct or refuse it. If the regulator accepts the code, it essentially forms part of the legislative universe for that sector on how the act works within their space. Excuse me for that one. So the Academy of Science of South Africa is explicitly looking to develop a code of conduct for the research sector. Last year, there was a draft version of the code that went around for public commentary. And within our division, we did render some commentary, and a bit later in the presentation today, I'm going to show how we have already started building a response for the scenario if the regulator approves the code of conduct. But we're still early days. So once the Academy of Science of South Africa shares their code with the regulator will establish a period for public commentary So if you didn't get a chance to comment yet, there's still plenty of opportunity to do so. And we'll do our best from our side to advertise those opportunities internally as well. And then we have a privacy regulation within the university as well. And good news, it has since been approved. A few more privacy basics. Privacy legislation establishes a few roles. Within a South African context, there is a responsible party. So that is the party that determines the purpose of and means for processing personal information. So why are we processing information? How are we going to do it? What are we doing it for? When are we going to do it? Right? Responsible party. An operator is a third party that can assist the responsible party in that processing under a contract or a mandate. And then we have a data subject. That is the person to whom the personal information relates. And I like this part of our legislation because with no irony at all, we use information and data as near synonyms in the same sentence. So from my side, as we talk on further today, when I say information, I'm going to mean it in the broadest sense possible. Right? Unless a specific piece of legislation or context requires me to distinguish between data and information explicitly, I am just going to say information for ease of communication. Yeah. For those who want to stay on afterwards and have a bit of a philosophical, lost my words there, have a debate about the difference between data and information, we can certainly do that. Some more basics. As I mentioned earlier, it's about trust. So I'd like us to pause here for a moment and think about the last time you had to fill in a form. Ask yourself, did you understand the why behind each question? And did you trust the form owner? And if you didn't trust the owner, did you lie? How many of us, when we go and visit a corporate or friends or family that live in a gated estate, for example, get stopped by security and asked to provide certain information? Do we trust the security at the front desk? Do we lie on the form when they ask for our phone number? They might have a very, very good reason to ask. It might be it's a security measure that they take in terms of knowing how many people are in the building if there's a requirement for an evacuation for fire. Could have a wonderful reason like that. But then they need to be able to articulate that to you. If they can't articulate that to you, then do you still give the truthful information? As another one, what about a form that asks for your South African ID number? Assuming that this form has a separate version for non-South Africans. Ask for your South African ID number, and then the very next question asks for your birth date or your age. That might indicate that the form owner does not know what is contained within an ID number, or in other words, they do not recognize the value of an ID number. The first 6 digits, in case there are a few on the call that don't know, the first 6 digits of your ID number, that is your birthday. And if somebody has your birth date, they can work out your age. So if a form asks for ID number and then any combination of your birth date or age, that's a red flag. So for us as researchers and for staff in the university, when we're asking people to provide such information, and we display a lack of knowledge or lack of an appreciation of the value of the information we're asking for, then there's a good chance that we're going to drive down participation or perhaps have incomplete or inaccurate information collected instead. So remember, we want to limit surprise, but in doing that, it's also about building trust. But luckily, we have a guide for that. Right? We have a special guide on how, collecting information responsibly. It's designed around surveys, but you can adapt the lessons therein and apply it to, for example, interviews, focus groups, etc. And I'll provide links to all of the resources right at the end. All right, responsibilities. What the university expects from our staff and students and our service providers. Remember, our operators, the third parties. Number one, we take steps to protect our own personal information. Remember, I talked about credential stuffing, and I remember it's when the password and email combination is reused at multiple online services. That's not protecting your own personal information. If we were to go to a walk to a local coffee shop in Stellenbosch, there's a good chance that you'll find unattended laptops, mobile devices, etc. That's not taking steps to protect your own personal information. And we need to be better about these things because there is a lot of valuable information in your phone and on your laptop. So if we take, most importantly, is let's protect our own personal information, because if we do that, it links nicely into responsibility to protecting the personal information of others. So if we reduce the chance of our inbox, our laptop, our phones being compromised, then the information of the others contained therein is also protected. Right? So personal information security, let's get that right and apply those lessons to protecting the personal information of others. And also, I hope, as we've been chatting today, that you've been realizing how valuable your own information is and taking those lessons and applying it to the personal information of others too. Number three, privacy isn't the same thing for everybody. There is a legislative definition, but how it is considered in one household may differ from another household. So we encourage you to contribute to discussions about privacy and related policies when the opportunities do appear. The very next one is going to be the ASSAf code. So we encourage you to contribute to those discussions too. And then number four, we need to report breaches and incidents. And our regulation on one slide. So POPIA is a principles-based piece of legislation that future-proofs the legislation somewhat against having to adapt when every piece of new technology emerges, right? Because we should be able to apply those principles to the new technology when it arises. But that means POPIA doesn't have that many hard and fast rules, which sometimes makes it a little tricky to navigate for those who prefer working with some fixed rules. So what we've done here at the university, we've tried to clarify POPIA's principles within our context. And where appropriate, we've linked to tools, etc., to help you with those. Let's call it the few harder rules of POPIA. POPIA has 8 principles. We've attempted to streamline it down to 6. But if there is a conflict between our regulation and the law, then the law holds, all right? But very briefly, here are our principles. Number 1, We need to recognize and understand that information has value, and we need to respond appropriately to that value of information. So in practice, if information is truly anonymous, which is not that easy to do, by the way, true anonymity is not as simple as hiding a column in an Excel spreadsheet. Right? But let's say you've managed to completely anonymize some information. Privacy legislation may not even apply to that information anymore. So the level of security you need to apply to that anonymous information is very different from the level of security you need to apply to identified health information. Doesn't mean you don't apply any security, because security is also about protecting the information from unwanted loss, not just unwanted access, but also unwanted loss. But once we have an understanding of how valuable information is, we can make a more informed decision about how we invest in security and other measures around the information. And number two, POPIA allows for a host of different justifications for the lawful processing of personal information. Most of us are familiar with the concept of consent, informed consent. But beyond a research environment, POPIA enables more justifications than just consent, and some are better suited for different scenarios than consent. Because remember, consent isn't just about the point of time when the research participant signs the consent form. Remember that research participant can withdraw their consent at any time later. So you need, when you're working within a consent framework, you need to be able to manage the consent. You need to understand the impact of a withdrawal. You need to think about how do you manage the withdrawal of consent, etc. You even need to think about how you're going to get consent in the first place. That's can be quite difficult at times. An example of another justification would be for those who are employed by the university, payday. The university HR division does not go around to ask us for our consent to the processing of our salary information so that they can pay us each month. Rather, that processing is covered by our employment agreements with the university and applicable labor law. So the university doesn't need to ask our consent to pay our salaries. Yeah. So we can get into those a bit more in the Q&A session. Now let's move on with these principles for now. Principle 3, process only what you need to process to meet your goal. Now remember my picture of the fish. And as we enrich the email address, how we were able to make more and more sophisticated attacks. So an email address in isolation, that was just spam. But then when we could identify the domain as a university domain, we could start phishing. And once we could see how an organizational structure and reporting lines, we could start considering CEO fraud. So from a principal position, we try and limit how much we collect to only that which we need. Because the more we add, the more valuable the information becomes, and then the more risk surrounds that information. Principle 4, practice good security. Traditionally, information security is considered as a triad of confidentiality, so protecting against unwanted access, integrity/quality, protecting against unwanted edits to information. So you don't want your information to be corrupted, for example. And then availability, being able to access your information when you want to access it. So we're just asking from our privacy regulation that we practice good information security. And we do this not because POPI says we must do it. We do that for the peace of mind. We want to know that our research will survive a coffee spill on a laptop. We want to know that if we leave our laptop unattended in a coffee shop and it gets stolen, that our research can still continue, right? So that's availability. That's why we practice security. As a happy byproduct of doing that, however, we comply with privacy legislation. Remember when we think back to the integrated thinking conversation, this is an example of that in play. Then number 5, we need to be transparent. Remember, no surprises. And number 6, we need to know what to do in case of a breach. Then let's get into personal information impact assessments quickly. So this is an actual specific requirement from our legislation. It is a great tool for helping us consider or identify how valuable information actually is. Unfortunately, our government have not yet defined when we should run these, how we should run them, who should run them, how often, etc. So we have looked to Europe to see how they have modeled it. And then more recently, the ASSAf Code of Conduct have positioned a recommended approach, which is still up to debate and commentary, of course. But we have taken lessons from both and built a methodology that I'm going to share with you today. Those of you who are working with European partners, you might have seen that they've already asked you to comply with this particular aspect. If you are dealing with a European partner that needs you to do an impact assessment, you're more than welcome to reach out to us and we'll help you as best we can. And the best way to demonstrate how these work is to run one together. So let's run one together very quickly, at least step 1. So first off, I'd like you to think of a process, any process that involves personal information. I am going to, for illustration, I'm going to say I'm going to buy a movie ticket online. So that's my process. Follow along with that, or if you've got your own one, keep that in your mind. All right. Once you've got your process, try to identify the fields, structured personal information, or the content or themes for unstructured that's involved in the processing of the personal information. So I clicked the wrong button. And we're back. All right, so movie ticket, what are we giving Sterkenico? I'm giving them my name, contact details. I'm giving payment details as well. I might be giving some location information as well. Right? And think about what you're asking in your process. Next, ask yourself if the information is anonymous, potentially identifiable in a given context, or explicitly identifiable. So let me focus on potentially identifiable, for example. Let's say you're doing a research project on Stellenbosch University's executive level of management of the rectorate. And you say, I'm going to make this anonymous, so I'm not going to put name or surname down. But then you do capture information like gender identity of individual or academic speciality. So even though you haven't included a name and surname of a member of the rectorate, but you've captured their degrees, for example. That is such a small group of people that with just the degree information and access to the internet, we can figure out who the individuals are. So that is what I'm referring to, potential identifiability within a given context. So think about your process. Is it anonymous? Is it maybe identifiable or explicitly identifiable? Now, our movie ticket example, that's identifiable. I have given a phone number, which is considered a unique identifier by our regulator. I've given a name and surname. I've given an email address. I've probably given a credit card information. That's all identifiable. Okay, so our movie ticket is an identifiable process. And then finally, is any of the information considered as special or particularly high value? Our regulator has defined certain types of information as more valuable than other types of information. That includes information about children, health, religion, race, trade union membership, and criminal behavior. Now, in our movie ticket example, we're not any of those. Right? So let's score it. If your information is completely anonymous, then POPIA may not even apply. And the value, remember, cyber criminal mindset, value of the information is probably very minimal. Potentially identifiable, that information value is probably low, but you need to check and be mindful about the context from where you've drawn the information from. For example, population size is a good thing to think about in this case. Then information that is identifiable, but is not in any particular way more valuable than that. So medium value. Special information on its own is considered medium value. And a combination of identifiable and special is of high value. So once you have that view, remember when we talked about security, you start designing your research data management plan accordingly to appropriately account for the value of information you're working with. And online, we do have a tool to help you determine if you need to run a full assessment. Will help you determine the value of the information, just like we've done now, but in a more structured manner. It will help you determine the value of the information you're going to be working with. It's also going to check those few hard rules that do exist from the regulator side, in particular prior authorization. Prior authorization is required for any research process that is of such a high risk that you first need to go to the regulator and ask them for permission to do it. But there's a very small number of scenarios where this applies. But our tool helps you figure out if you're in that space. The regulator has said an application for prior authorization can take up to 14 weeks. So that can throw out a research timeline significantly, 3.5 months. On top of any other gatekeeper permissions, ethics approvals required, that's a lot of time. Okay, so if you're concerned about that, run your research through our tool, and we'll help you figure out if you need to approach the regulator or not. And if you do need to approach the regulator, we'll help you. Okay. And as I mentioned, bullet 3, value of the information you plan to process, and where to go next if you require additional assistance. Okay, nearly done with the formal stuff. So what's the real risk continued? If you remember, a fifth of breaches considered by IBM were attributed to stolen or compromised credentials. So there are several services online that allow you to check if you've ever been compromised. And I've put a few on screen, ranging from the free to the browser plugin to the enterprise solution. You should be able to find any of these in your favorite search engine. I like DuckDuckGo, but I suppose most of you use Google, and there might be one or two using Bing. You should be able to find these services through there. And for our last bit today, before we get into the Q&A session, I invite you to try one of these services. The way they work is these services collect breached data sets, and then they index them and make them searchable. So you can search these breached data sets by providing these services with an email address. Some of them take phone numbers. And then the service will compare that email address against all the breached data sets. And wherever that email address has been breached, the service will display a short report that says where it was compromised, what was compromised with it, what is the impact of that compromise, and what you can do to mitigate the fallout from that compromise. So I invite you right now in another window on another device, if you were already doom scrolling on your phone, visit one of these and give it a try. And if you have been compromised, please share it in the chat. Before we go a bit further than that, just also a word of caution. What you see cannot be unseen. So you can use these services to check on a partner or a parent or a child to see if they've been compromised somewhere. But there are a few, let's call them embarrassing breaches historically. But these services do offer a nice version of multi-factor authentication. So you won't be able to figure out if a parent was caught in the Ashley Madison breach, but just still tread cautiously nonetheless. Right. So take some time while we're wrapping up during the Q&A to try these services out. And if you have been compromised, please paste that service in the chat. That might help somebody else on the call today recognize that they might be compromised and give them the first step towards addressing that compromise. And very briefly, we have some internal resources all at our website, sun.ac.za/privacy. You'll find our regulation, the impact assessment tool I mentioned, specific guidance notes, all of the guidance notes from University of South Africa that I mentioned. You can access the sector resources. You can request facilitated training. So for your academic department or your research project or your past environment, we'll gladly come over and help you with some facilitated training. It could be a presentation like we're doing today, or it can be something far more practical. And also that is our channel for reporting breaches as well. And that's it for the presentation. Happy to spend the rest of the time we have on questions. All right, let me catch up with the chat quickly. Now we had some cameras on and lots of fishing for my fish picture. All right, happy to take any questions. Post them in the chat or raise your hand. We are I think we're a smallish group. 33, okay, raise your hands. That's probably better and more manageable. And of course, if you've been breached anywhere, please do share. That's always interesting. Right, we do have a question in the chat. Prof. Lana, are you talking about the have I been pwned in Firefox Monitor, etc.? Have I been pwned doesn't require an account. You can run any email address through that. Dhashed on the other side, though, is the corporate enterprise version, so they do require an account. Oh, not a problem. Okay, you went for Dhash first. Okay. And for those who don't know, pwned is a 90s internet slang. That's when you completely defeat your opponent in an online game. Right, we stay on for. Oof, 9 data breaches. 3. Any particularly scary ones? Canva was one that really surprised me because the way I discovered it was through the service and not through being notified by Canva. Remember I discussed notification requirements for a breach. We have a few that are too scared to look. Well, even if you don't look, maybe go and change a few passwords still. Thanks, Fadwa, for replying to that one about the recording. South Africans, I think you would probably, for those who ever held property in eThekwini municipality, you might find yourself caught there. Chemical, historical. There was a big breach. What was it called? Called Master Deeds, where most South Africans born before 2014 were compromised by a property endeavor attempting to build a client list. Right, but we don't need to focus questions on where we've been breached. If there's anything about the content we've discussed, or if you have a specific question about your own research project, feel free to share. But we'll give our colleagues a few minutes to see if they raise anything, but see some comments. Let's give them a few minutes to see if anyone raises a question. Otherwise, we'll call it a day, colleagues. Oh, we have one hand. Please go ahead. Is that Prof. Anton?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
If we receive data from a collaborating company that they claim have been anonymized, does that absolve us from any further requirements for POPIA?
It's going to depend on your agreement with them. They will probably still be the responsible party. And so you're not completely absolved. What you might do if you discover that the information is actually identifiable, is that you would need to report it to them. And they would probably need to treat it as an incident, and they should investigate and respond appropriately.
But if the data is, as far as we are we can determine anonymized, purely anonymized. You've got no personal identifiers in the data. Does that mean we can just handle it as data? We don't have to worry further about more. We have institutional, we have MOUs in place for protecting data provided, but it's not considered to be personal information as POPIA defined.
Yes, it would depend on the agreement, so your MOU or your data transfer agreement or whatever agreement's in place. Even if it's even if it is anonymized personal information or non-personal information, there might still be other stipulations in the agreement. So it's going to depend heavily on that. I'm afraid there's no universal answer for that one.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Right, Fadwa, it doesn't seem like there is anything. So perhaps we can close here. As I mentioned, that website, sun.ac.za privacy, you can log questions, etc. there for us, or you can mail me directly and I'll do my best to help. But otherwise, thank you, colleagues, for sharing your lunchtime with me. And have a good afternoon and short week further.